Greetings, ladies and metal gents, and welcome to this latest edition of Re-Tifos, where I take old stories I've narrated and update them to modern audio standards. This particular story is called The Great Sin, written by ShneekeyTheLost. The Galactic Scouting and First Contact Division was a prestigious organization. They risked life and extremity to go out into an unexplored, if at least somewhat scanned, wilderness of the galaxy, and to be the first point of contact for emerging sentients. Of course, such a weighty and hazardous occupation required extensive training beyond basic, indeed requiring no less than 3 advanced prerequisites before one could even apply to the academy. As a branch which is funded by and answers to the Council, it has many foibles and no less security checks to ensure that only well-adjusted beings are selected for these very often long journeys within relative compact vessels and no real contact with civilization for the tour period. There are also some courses which are security flagged for other reasons, one of which is most often remarked upon as the final stage course where title was simply redacted. Many students often wonder about this course, which appears to be a relatively short one as courses go, and whose passing is one of the highest bars and mandatory for graduation. The class came with a waiver of permission for mental blockage for all who fail the course. Rumors abound about the contents and the nature of this course, ranging from a ribald supposition of a course on the mating habits of pre-FTL species to the hypothetical black hole map and navigation techniques that was a joke of the physics department. But no one who knew would tell. So the students were unaware of what they were getting into as they filed into the class. It was clearly held in a lecture hall, although there was security being so tight it might simply be a staging area, some supposed. Eventually, the electromagnetic blip signaled the beginning of the class. Roll call was taken and was double-checked. Absentees were noted and security personnel were sent to detain and remove these individuals from the academy. Then the doors were sealed and locked, which caused a slight murmur to ripple along the spectra of the communication. "Greetings, class. Before we begin, I am legally required to advise you that what you are about to endure today has been given a Category 4 content advisory for concepts and or subjects potentially damaging to the mental and emotional health and well-being of the average citizen. If this is sufficient to dissuade you from wishing to participate, this is your opportunity to indicate so and leave. Needless to say, you will fail the academy. However, no other prejudice will be appended to your record, and you will be offered positions in related fields according to your specialty. Also, please note at this time that any who are unable to handle the material and find themselves in mental or emotional distress will receive counseling and possible memory alteration at the Academy's cost as per regulations regarding such restricted material and the necessity of presenting them. This will of course also disqualify you. However, as before, you will be referred to another branch without prejudice. And of course, you can never share this with anyone not cleared for the self-same reason." Electronic buzz filled the room briefly. Clear up to the microwave carrier bands as students discussed this amongst themselves. A few made their indications. They were politely escorted out by security and the doors relocked. Soon, the class settled down and the instructor spoke up again. "I suppose many of you are wondering about the nature of this class. Well, it fulfills several purposes simultaneously. First, a scout needs to keep their wits about themselves under even the most vulgar and vile scenarios. To be blunt, even if this didn't need to be covered specifically, something of this nature would need to be covered to ensure the stability of those going out into the black. However, even should that not be a consideration, this would still need to be addressed so that no one can... Well, I get ahead of myself, I suppose. Today is a history lesson, and you learn just how horrific this job can be. In your regs and requirements entry-level course, it may have been mentioned that we have a very strict policy of non-interference with pre-FTL civilizations, and that the punishment for failing to follow this structure is one of the most severe any branch can ever levy. You may also have become aware that this is not always the case, but never was it explained to you why that change of policy, why that strict punishment needed to take place. Today, I will For today, you learn the event that we few in the Scouts refer to simply as the Great Sin. The third-degree articulation of seriousness was out of proportion to the second-category religious term used, which caused a murmur of confusion amongst the classroom. It happened. Oh heck, why bother going over dry and boring dates? You know the date of the policy was changed. That's close enough. Our Scouts, and no, you will never learn of the names of the captain or crew of this mission, out of respect for their kin and their memory, found life, sapient life no less, on one of the most inhospitable planets imaginable. It was an oxy-nitro atmosphere with a dense nickel-iron core that gave it a ridiculously deep gravity well, some 30 to 50% above galactic standards and, previously at least, 20% outside scouting parameters. It was also at least 15% inside the standard habitable belt for the star it was orbiting, contributing to an ambient temperature average that can only be described as absurdly hot and humid, which should also have excluded it from survey. Had they not received electromagnetic transmissions of an obviously artificial origin coming from it, the survey group initially expected to find a probe or other marker indicating a previous exploration attempt. But what they found was an orbital spacefaring civilization, but it was a particularly strange one. Alas, we didn't know how strange until it was far, far too late. The fourth-degree mourning gesture caused a shock of silence to fall over the lecture hall. They seemed well on their way to achieving FTL. They had gotten into orbit, had quite a few satellites, at least one habitable station, a surprising collection of debris just left up there that they were getting around to realizing was probably a bad idea left unchecked. All things you'd expect from a post-industrial but pre-FTL civilization, except they were badly factionalized. There were not an extremities full, but over 100 independent factions and tribes, and many of them used entirely different communication protocols with each other, requiring translators to communicate internally with their own species. And this, may I remind you, is a species who had managed to cheat the thrust-to-weight ratio formula on one of the highest gravity planets to grace sapiens ever discovered and somehow get themselves into orbit. They had to discover rocketry with a specific impulse of over 400 just to get out of the atmosphere. And thanks to a geological anomaly, they were able to achieve it without nuclear fission or fusion. Apparently, their planet had seen multiple die-offs, sequestering truly staggering amounts of carbon, which, under geologic pressure, formed into a surprisingly energy-dense solid or semi-fluid mass of carbon chains. This was then further refined and used as fuel source, allowing them to bootstrap themselves into this phase very early in their technological development, relatively speaking. Then again, it is also why they advanced from muscle, wind, and water power to electric in as short a period of time as they did, due to the high oxygen content of the atmosphere. Combustion could continue practically indefinitely, given sufficient fuel from the ambient atmosphere alone. They were able to boil a liquid into a gaseous form, and use that expansion to spin turbines to generate power, entirely bypassing entire fields of chemistry until much later. And to be fair, they were obsessively curious beings, and geniuses at intuitive research. Once they realized a concept was possible, nothing would stop them until they had managed to achieve it somehow. In less than a few dozen standard solar cycles, they had gone from crude electron signal via conductive wire to controlled fission. Sadly, we didn't realize until it was too late why they had advanced so rapidly. You see, this species was predatory omnivore. Yes, your teachers probably told you how rare that combination is. But in this case, there can be absolutely no mistake. A pursuit predator, no less. They simply chased their prey until it fell over from exhaustion, capable of non-stop motion for shift periods at a time without tiring, which meant they had a very strong pack mentality, and this carried over to their social development, such as it was, and what there was of it. Unfortunately, their high oxygen level atmosphere also permitted them to discover combustion at an absurdly early period in their development, which quickly gave rise to basic metallurgy and even alloying, all while just barely having settled down from a hunter-gatherer societal structure. However, as with any apex predator, they needed a certain range to sustain themselves, and were fiercely territorial. In other words, they applied predatory pressure on themselves, and if resource scarcity wasn't enough of a reason for them to fight amongst themselves, there was a variant on philosophy they came up with which focused on the ideation and idealization of one or many fictional beings of arbitrary power, and would then proceed to fight each other over differences in those beliefs. In short, they were the single most hyper-aggressive species ever recorded to achieve spaceflight. However, when the scout team reached them, they appeared to have mostly, finally, gotten past that phase of their development. They had a central global body where the various tribes could diplomatically work out their differences. You could see the beginnings of a true planetary government starting to form. And so, as with practice at the time, the scout team initiated contact and informed them that one of the requirements for entry to the galactic civilization was a single governing body for the planet. The fourth-tier morning gesticulation, coupled with the third-level hazard appellate, indicated something truly horrifying was about to occur. The various tribal leaders received and acknowledged this message, and held a great meeting in their tribe's united hall. The scouts were pleased at having successfully nudged another species to the path of enlightenment. That was when it began. At first, the scouts didn't understand what they were seeing. Then they simply were incapable of believing it. You see, to escape the down-dragging gravity, of this dense planet, they had extensive research into rocketry. Unfortunately, they had also created rockets for the expressed and implicit purpose of, for lack of a better term, intentionally crashing into a target for the purpose of causing damage as a weapon of war. But not content with the kinetic payload of such a device, they did something worse. Far, far worse. They had the capability of fission for some time, although they were apparently loath to actually harness its power, despite how relatively common radioactive isotopes were in its crust. Likely due to the crudity of their process for harnessing fission energy. The scouts had read reports of runaway fission reactors being instigated on purpose, but had dismissed them as works of fiction. Unfortunately, they were not. These rockets had enough of a targeting package to hit an inhabited sector and cause an unstable runaway fission reaction to decay rapidly in the center of the population zone. In less than a single rotation of the planet, billions were dead. The instructor paused to permit the students to soak up the sheer horror and scale of the atrocity. Shock and horror swept through the lecture hall. Some few actually passed out. The instructor made notes of who, and to get them therapy afterwards. He didn't blame them, of course. No one could. There was a reason the scouts had the single highest requirements for emotional stability, and it wasn't for the absurdly long tours of duty away from any civilized port. They simply had to handle situations that no normal being would be required to encounter over their lifespan. And while it was physically as well as emotionally painful for the instructor to inflict this upon these students, he also realized the necessity. Flipping manipulators up in a calming gesture, he finally brought the class back under emotional control, more or less. Well, that's not the worst part. His emissions was flat and toneless, merciless in its transmission, yet duty forced him onward anyway. The worst part was that the survivors then proceeded to hail the scout team. Yes, the detonation of hundreds, if not thousands, of runaway fission reactions was not sufficient to exterminate the species. They are simply that hardy and resilient, as well as apparently prepared for such possibilities. I suppose that at least it is to be expected from a species who not only has a phrase concept, but an acronym for the idea of we limit our hostility only because to refrain from it doing so would mean our suicide as well as the death of all life on this planet. Normally, one would consider any survivors to be a cause for rejoice, were it not for the contents of the transmission. I play that transmission back to you now, unedited, so that the full horror of this may be known to you. A data crystal was inserted into a playback device, and the transmission, appropriately translated into Gulstan, of course, played out. Galactic Scout Mission. This is Undersecretary Bragg, senior surviving member of the remaining political faction. Please be advised that according to our remaining satellite feeds, all other nations have been exterminated, and this planet is now governed by a single polity. As such, we respectfully request admission to your galactic civilization. Over. One could almost hear the neutrino background noise in the chamber was so silent. So you see, my unfortunate students, not only did they see the near extermination of their entire species to be only a solution to the problem issued, they saw nothing morally wrong with what they did. He offered no apology for the atrocities committed. Upon further communication, it became apparent that he didn't even comprehend that an apology should have been necessary. That, my students, is why we call this the Great Sin. Not their great sin. Ours. Due to our interference, this occurred. Because of our misjudgment, billions of sentient beings died in one of the most horrific ways possible. An entire planet was rendered practically uninhabitable, even by their hellish standards, for longer than their industrial age lasted. And this was our fault. Every word spat out in a complete sentence to drive home the importance of the topic at hand. Let there be no misunderstanding or mistake in this room. When you go out into the black, when you encounter species who are about to achieve uplift, you too may have to make a judgment call. Remember always, when you do, that the consequences of your judgment are also yours to bear. This scout team, who shall remain unnamed forevermore, and whose records are otherwise completely sealed under the Security Act, made a judgment call, one which was within protocol of their time, but one which nonetheless resulted in this. The instructor paused, then added with a second-degree casual gesture, which was understated for effect. They all suicided, you know, the scout team, that is. Therapy couldn't get to them in time. They turned in their reports, and apparently by unanimous decision, went to full impulse without gravitational dampeners active. The ship's AI had to navigate the ship back to dock, apparently pre-programmed to do so. They just couldn't take what had happened, what they caused to happen. Sure, maybe they might have done it to themselves, given enough time and space, but there might always have been a chance that they might not have either. And it is that uncertainty that, according to the final log entry countersigned by the entire crew, that drove them to that expiation of their sins. Should they have? Well, of course not. Two wrongs do not make a right. Compounding atrocities with yet another atrocity, if on a smaller scale, doesn't help anyone. For that matter, they acted within regulation. The true burden of the guilt lays not at their pseudopods, but at the ones who wrote those regulations they adhered to. But maddened with grief and sickened in the mind and emotional center, they made yet another poor decision. The lessons, then, are manifold and clear. First, that we have set down these regulations not arbitrarily, but out of experience and hard-won knowledge at the costs too staggering to contemplate for long. Violate these regulations at your peril and risk another great sin. Second, that there are always possible complications, and that one should never act overly hasty or without proper consideration of the consequences of your actions. Third, that sometimes terrible consequences can come from actions which still fall within regulatory parameters, despite all you can do. Fourth, that we never forget, so that we never repeat this tragedy again. And finally, that therapy is always there to help. No matter how horrific, no matter how traumatic, therapy can help you, even if it means memory wipe. Just please, come back to us and let us help you, if the burden becomes too heavy. After an extended pause for effect, he closed with, I now open the forum to questions. Shocked silence prevailed until one student, perhaps more hardy than his fellows, perhaps simply morbidly curious, indicated question status, which was then accepted and permitted broadcast. What happened to them? The primitives, I mean. Did they go, extinct? The timid tone was natural for the normally taboo topic of extinction. Even the word itself has a second-degree vulgarity under most circumstances. Yet the instructor neither admonished nor even warned the student. It was, after all, the proper term. And the instructor inwardly applauded the student with a gizzard necessary to ask. Astonishingly enough, no. Apparently it takes more than extended gamma wave emissions to kill off this particular species. And the fecund things have already recouped their numbers, and then some. They now have 4 planets in various systems in their sector, and have joined the galactic civilization, indeed. There was a second-degree human manipulation associated with the answer. Due to their preference for planets which no one else can colonize, they've taken to colonizing planets in systems which have already been surveyed and rejected, obtaining right to the systems for tiny percentages of what it would normally cost to expand for most species, due to the lack of counterbids on the property. The instructor surveyed the hall again before asking, "Any other questions?" One student indicated a query with an urgency flag and was put to the top of the queue for answering.
Do you indicate then that this species not only achieved FTL, but was accepted and is still alive today?
Correct. They tend to be a bit shy, which is of no bad thing, but they are a full member of the galactic civilization pool. Generally, of course, we tend to leave them to their own devices unless actively requested otherwise.
Because it is feared that they may do this again? The student asked in a macabre astonishment.
No, because having seen what they were willing to do to themselves, we have no desire to see what they might do to us if their paranoia indicates that we are somehow a hindrance to them. They seem to be peaceful so far, and no one is in any particular hurry to poke that knert on the olfactory receptor. A first-degree gesture of Zen acceptance accompanies the last statement before concluding, "Any further questions?" "No? Then for today, class dismissed. Any who feel unwell are to report to therapy immediately. And please remember the security protocol concerning this class. Should you be seen discussing it with uncleared personnel, well, you should already be familiar with the punishment for that. So I bid you a good rest period. Class dismissed." End of story. I would just like to thank the T5 supporters: Bushmaster 117, Caspar Arnholtz, Strankzoon WRE, Elijah Silvercross, Gray, John Carrington, and Severin Cerberus. Thank you very much.